Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's seminar. My greatest pleasure today to introduce Christoph Leuschner, who's now Emeritus Professor at University of Goettingen. Christoph is as all our speakers, as I say every month, is an extremely well-known, well-cited person. His works a lot on tree diversity, water, carbon cycles. He did pioneering experiments looking at competition between roots of trees. He works in temperate systems. I realize now he also works in boreal systems and tropical systems. He does it all, many types of forests. His work has been cited over 18,000 times, and he has one of these incredible H indexes of over 100. So Christoph today is going to talk about drought and heat resistance of Central European tree species. Christoph, your talk.
Thanks a lot, Doug. Very friendly, and it's a pleasure for me to talk to you. Can you see my screen and my slides?
Yeah, all good.
Okay. Yeah, Doug had already said this is drought and heat resistance of Central European tree species, my topic. And I have roughly 30 minutes, so this is a short introduction about the health status of the trees and forests in mostly northern Central Europe. So I will focus on the lowlands. This is mostly Pleistocene, sandy soil, loamy soil. And it's of course the warmest part. It's much warmer than the uplands, of course. So climate change will act probably first in the lowlands before the uplands are affected as well. So first I talk briefly about key climatic stressors of trees. Then I have to talk a little bit about the growth trends in the past, because we have to know them to understand what's happening today with growth trends. And my main part is about recent growth trends and the climate sensitivity of growth of the major timber species in Central Europe. I will not talk about ecophysiology here because time is too short, but I will focus mostly on the growth trends and health status of beech, that's European beech, Scots pine, Norway spruce, several temperate oak species in Central and Southeastern Europe, and also Douglas fir, which is a preferred timber species in Central Europe in recent time. And then briefly, I will present some data on recent tree mortality. And finally, I will make some recommendations for forestry, but this is mostly for the lowlands and not for the uplands. This is, of course, different there. So there are a lot of stressors to trees. I think most of you are familiar with at least some of them. I will mostly focus on the climatic and hydrologic stressors which are related to climate change. So this is heat. It's a direct stressor to trees and the photosynthetic system, for example. Then soil drought, of course. The intensity and severity of droughts has clearly increased. And high vapor pressure deficit. This is an independent factor of soil drought, which clearly stresses trees as well. So if you talk about climate change, I think these three main pathways are key to understand the response of trees. So growing frequency and severity of droughts, increasing heat stress, and rising atmospheric saturation deficits. And here are some data. The upper figure are soil moisture data for Europe, and especially in Central and Southern Europe, there's a clear negative trend during the last 40 years. You can see the average soil moisture in Europe has clearly declined. So this is a clear incidence that there is increasing stress by drought. In the lower figure, these are the extension, the spatial extension and the intensity of droughts in Germany during the last 70 years. You can see these large circles from 2018, 19, 20. They were the most severe droughts we have ever experienced during the last 2000 years, some people say. So this is acute stress which has damaged the trees and forests in Germany severely. Then heat is an independent factor. These are data about the number of hot days per year. A hot day is a year with a maximum above 30 degrees. And you can see, again, for Germany, there's an exponential increase in the number of heat days since about the 1980s. So this is the starting point, mostly of the recent warming trend. And in the lower figure, you can see the absolute maximum temperatures recorded in Germany. And you can also see there's a linear increase in these extreme temperatures. And finally, atmospheric demand, so the vapor pressure deficit. The upper figure is a global data set, and you can see clearly since the 1980s a more or less linear increase. So the atmosphere is getting drier and drier. And of course, we can also record this in northern Germany. These are data for the more continental and more oceanic regions of northern Germany. And you can roughly say that during the last 40 years, there's a 50% increase in the maximum VPDs recorded. So the stress exposed from the atmosphere is clearly increasing. So now let's talk about some growth trends in the past, because we have to understand this for explaining the recent growth. This is European beech, data from eastern France. This is basal area increment, and all stands at the age of 40 years. So there's no age effect in this. What you can see is nearly a tripling of growth during 100 years from 1900 to 2000. So there's a clear promotion, acceleration of growth rate. There are different driving factors, as you probably know. So the warming trend plays a role, carbon dioxide, of course, nitrogen deposition, perhaps also changes in forest management, and so on. And this can also be seen in Scots pine, for example. These are data for Poland. The site index is a measure of height growth, and you can see during these 100 years, there's a roughly 30% increase in height growth in Poland. And these are all the same age. And finally, I would like to show data from spruce. This is from Slovakia. This is a published study from other colleagues, and you can see these are the growth trajectories over lifespan of trees. The blue curve is for old spruces, which are at least 330 years old. You can see they started to grow in the past very slowly and then achieved a maximum growth rate, which is much lower than the recent one. The younger spruces started rapidly and reached a higher maximum growth rate and probably are not that long-lived as the older ones. So there's a clear acceleration of growth in the past. You can see this in many tree species in Central Europe. I think this is a very important background information to interpret the recent growth trends that we observe. So this is now my main topic. And I will first talk about European beech. This is from the natural forest vegetation, the most important tree species of Germany, that would normally cover nearly 2/3 of the German forests. And this is also quite widespread in northern Germany. This is the map of northern Germany. For all of you who are not familiar with the geography, there's the North Sea coast in the northwest and the Baltic Sea coast in the northeast. And the shades, the color shades, they display the precipitation gradient from northwest to southeast. So the southeast is quite continental and drier. And we have selected 30 mature beech stands in this region, and they clearly reflect the precipitation and climate continentality gradient. And here you can see some major results. These are growth chronologies for the 30 stands, each for roughly 150 years. This is basal area increment. And we have grouped the 30 stands into 4 groups: very dry, wet, and very wet, according to summer precipitation. And we are mostly interested in the growth trends during the last 40 years. This is the area right of the dashed line. You can see in 3 of the 4 groups, we have a significant negative growth trend since about 40 years. And only in the wettest group, we still have stable growth trends today. And roughly 70% of all stands and core trees recently have a negative growth trend in the lowlands. Of course, this is alarming for forest ecologists, but also for foresters, and we were much interested in the driving forces of this decline. And we have tested a lot of factors, and this is the major factor on the left. We have plotted the basal area increment trend against here the change, the long-term change in summer climatic water balance. This is the difference between precipitation P and potential evapotranspiration, PET. And you can see the more negative the climatic water balance has got during the last decades, the more negative is the recent growth trend. So water availability is clearly a very important factor. There are other factors important as well. One is, of course, competition in the stand. So tree distance, which is, of course, a measure of competition intensity, is a secondary factor, but not that important as the climatic water balance. And you can even map the growth trends. And you can see east of this dashed line, this is northeastern Germany, then the center is Berlin. You can see that we have only negative growth trends. So the red arrows downward mean a negative recent growth trend. West of this line, we have similar size number of positive and negative growth trends. And it's interesting to find that the 350 millimeter precipitation isoline for summer precipitation separates these 2 regions. But this is not a local phenomenon. We have checked the literature, and here is the distribution range of European beech in Europe. Only Norway is missing, unfortunately. And you can see in every place where you have these red stars, you can see there are recent negative growth trends in lowland stands. And you can see this reaches from northeastern Spain to northeastern Germany, from Belgium, eastern France, to Italy, and even to Hungary. So it's quite widespread in the lowlands. But how is it in the uplands? Of course, beech is a more typical species higher up in the mountains. And here we've investigated an elevation transect in the Black Forest in southwestern Germany. You can see 4 stands at 110 meters elevation, 300 and 640 millimeters. In all cases, we still have this negative recent growth trend. Only higher up, say above 1,000 or 1,200 meters in the top layers, in the top levels, we have still a positive growth trend where climate warming is accelerating growth of beech. So this is apparently a quite widespread phenomenon lower down in the middle levels and in the lowlands. So the next important species is Scots pine. This is naturally occurring only in small patches in Germany, but is quite widespread planted because it's economically so feasible and so important. And this is the most important tree species now economically in northern Germany. So we have huge plantations of Scots pine there. We have also investigated some of them. This is again the precipitation gradient. This looks much more positive. You can see mostly stable or even increasing growth trends during the last 30, 40 years. So this is different from beech, clearly. However, if we analyze more clearly the climate growth relationships, we find also some sensitivities. And the left figure shows the dependence of the climate's growth relationship on mean summer precipitation. And you can see the drier the climate, this is more in the east, the more sensitive growth becomes to climate. And this clearly shows that probably future warming and drying of the climate will harm pine growth. On the other hand, we still found, and this is shown on the right side, a positive effect of winter warming. This is the temperature in February, March. You can see this clearly still promotes pine growth. And our explanation is that both effects, a higher sensitivity now to warmer and drier summers, but a winter warming effect, they still are balancing each out, and so we still have a stable growth rate of pine. However, there are lots of reports about Scots pine dieback now in southern Germany, for example, in Switzerland, in Spain. So Scots pine is also quite sensitive to the warming trend. Then some words about Norway spruce. This is still the economically most important tree species of Germany and other countries in Central Europe. I won't talk too much about the dieback because probably many of you have heard about large-scale dieback during the last 5-6 years. In central Germany, huge areas have collapsed totally, so the forest is totally gone. I will more focus on long-term growth trends, and this is a study by colleagues in the Eastern Carpathians, and you can see there's a nearly similar pattern as we found in beech. In lower elevations, here this is below 800 or 850 millimeters elevation, we have a recent growth decline, but higher up this is more stable or maybe even increasing in the top layers. So probably the response is quite similar to that of beech. I will later talk about some dieback figures of spruce. Then let's talk about the European oak species. In Central Europe, we only have 2 oak species, sessile oak and common oak. But we're also interested in some oaks which are quite related, which are growing in southeastern Europe. And this is Turkey oak and Hungarian oak. And we have conducted in the lowlands of Western Romania a study. And we have compared the long-term growth trends first of beech again, and another local species. This is silver linden, Tilia tomentosa, with these 3 oak species. So Quercus petrea, sessile oak, Frynetto, Hungarian oak, and Ceres as Turkey oak. And you can see again, as in Central Europe, the negative recent growth trends in beech, but also in silver linden. But on the other hand, as a contrast, stable or even increasing growth trends in 3 oak species. So this is clearly a sign they're growing side by side, that they're much more drought and heat resistant than the oak, the beech and the linden species. And another indicator of the sensitivity to climate is the growth synchrony in the stands. If you have a stressor, and this is a strong stressor, you can expect that the individual trees in a stand will have the same growth patterns and respond in the same way to environmental fluctuation. And if the synchrony is decreasing, this is more or less a sign that the trees are not so much affected by climatic stress. You can see here that the beech and oaks, linden stands, this is blue and green color, they're clearly increasing since about the 1980s, while the nearby 3 oak species, they're clearly decreasing in their synchrony. So apparently they are less affected than beech and linden by the climate warming in the recent decades. We were also interested in some minor broadleaf tree species. For example, Norway maple, or also ash, little-leaved linden, and also hornbeam. These are growth chronologies from 8 stands in central Germany. This is the driest region in central Germany. And you can see in all species we have a continuous stable growth rate, so no decline as we found, for example, in spruce or in beech. So clearly these minor timber species, they are clearly much hardier against drought and frost than beech and spruce, for example. However, their importance for forestry is quite low at the moment. And finally, I would like to talk about Douglas fir. Douglas fir is from North America. It has been introduced already 200 years ago, but it's highly productive, and this is the hope of foresters in Central Europe, to replace spruce, which has a large-scale dieback in many regions. And we have also investigated the species, and we have tested whether this is really so drought hardy as is expected. And these are 15 stands in northern Germany in the lowlands. And you can see they mostly, the majority, have a sharp decline in their growth rates. This is basal area increment since about the year 2000. Only a minority of stands still has a stable growth rate. And these are not very old stands. They are 40 to 60 years old. So apparently they are in a similar way affected, for example, as beech in the same climate. And we have then analyzed the major driving forces of negative growth trends. And again, we have growth correlations with the climatic water balance in summer. This is the upper left figure, and you can see there's a negative correlation. So the more negative the climatic, this is the summer precipitation. The lower the summer precipitation, the more negative the growth trend is. The higher the mean summer temperature is, the lower the growth trend is, the more negative it is. The more negative the climatic water balance in summer is, the more negative the growth trend is. And finally, a higher continentality and temperature is also a factor which drives negative growth trends in Douglasphere. And we have finally investigated how recent growth is related to the growth in the past. So we have plotted the maximal basal area increment at use against the recent growth trend. And you can see this is a negative relationship. So the faster the trees were growing in the past, the more negative is the recent growth trend. So slower growing individuals perform better at the moment, and the faster growing trees are more sensitive. And finally, we have sought for indication how heat might affect the growth trend. These are data from Western and Southwestern Germany. And this is a comparison of Douglas fir, Scots pine, sessile oak, and European beech, growing the same environments. And we have analyzed the influence of heat on the growth trend. And you can see Douglas fir clearly is the most sensitive species. So heat is really harming Douglas fir more than Scots pine, while sessile oak is nearly insensitive and beech only a little. So there are clear differences apparently in the heat sensitivity of these tree species. So I would like to summarize what we have seen about past growth trends and recent growth trends, and I've formulated a hypothesis. During the last 100 years or the last 50 years, clearly we had an increase in warmth, we have higher carbon dioxide concentrations, we have an increase in nitrogen deposition. This all probably has accelerated tree growth. We have seen this, and probably those trees which grew fastest and the species which grew fastest profited most. And fast-growing species are Douglas fir, spruce, for example. Slower growing species are mostly the oaks. And now, since the last 30 to 40 years, more drought and more heat probably has harmed these species and has turned the positive growth trend to a negative growth trend. And those species and individuals that grew fastest, they turned most negative, while the slower growing species like oak, for example, they were less affected. This is a hypothesis, but I think many data are supporting it. So this is about recent growth trends in the lowlands. Then I come to a few data on tree mortality, and perhaps some of you have seen these photographs from collapsing stands in large areas in central Germany. This is from the Harz Mountains in central Germany. Most of the forests are gone. This is mostly spruce, but there's also a dieback of beech locally, mostly on thaws-exposed slopes. And this mostly started at 2018, and we had this mega drought, which lasted until 2020 or even 2022. This has killed a lot of trees in Germany. And this is some of the data. So in the 6 years of the mega drought, roughly 500,000 hectares of forest has been killed. This is roughly 300 million cubic meters of damaged wood in Germany. And this is a loss to the forestry sector of an estimated 15 billion euros. So this is enormous. But you can see the dieback was quite localized in central Germany, so more in the uplands, less in the lowlands. And I would like to present a more long-term record of the tree mortality in Germany. This is produced by Thünen Institute. This is from the period from 1998 to 2022. And if we first start with spruce, this on the right side, you can see until about 2018, this was quite a minor natural dieback, say of less than 1.5% per year. But then there was an explosion of the death rate, so up to 10% per year. In certain stands up to 50%, they totally collapsed. Beech in the top there had a quite low mortality rate, average less than 1.5 or 1.3% per year. But then there was a slight increase all over Germany, so up to 0.5%, but not 1%. The oaks, they had some peaks in dieback in the past. You can see this normally fell below 0.5% with a slight increase up after 2018, but they are not so much related to drought or heat periods, more often to frost in winter, for example, or insect attack. So they're not so much affected by climate in this region. Some of the minor broadleaf tree species are affected as well. An example is sycamore, maple, for example, which also has been hit hard during this mega drought. While Scots pine in the lowlands still mostly has a low dieback rate. You can see a mortality rate per year of less than 0.5% and only a slight increase up to 1% around 2018-20. And for Douglas fir, the available data show that until 2018, the dieback was quite low, but then there was a slight peak as well. And these are some data for Douglas fir in the federal state, which has the largest Douglas fir plantation. So this is in southwestern Germany. You can actually see dieback is still low, but the health of the trees has been deteriorating since roughly 30 years already. So there's a continuous increase in needle loss already. So on average, now they have roughly 30% of needles lost. And the general canopy health is not that good today. So I come to the end, and I would like to compare the climate sensitivity of the tree species and their growth patterns. And these are schematic descriptions of the major tree species. In blue, this is the growth rate. This is mostly for the lowlands, so not for the uplands. And in red, this is the mortality rate. And you can see for Norway spruce, clearly we have a growth decline since roughly 20 to 30 years. A low mortality until 2018, and then an explosion of mortality and a collapse of many stands. Scots pine in the lowlands still is quite stable, and mortality was quite low with a slight peak during 2018 to 20. But of course, there are other regions, as I mentioned, for example, in the upper Rhine Valley, in southwestern Germany, and Franconia, the central Alps in Switzerland, where we have a larger scale Scots pine dieback. So the species is not that drought and heat hardy as we thought before. And then Douglas fir in the lowlands was first promoted until roughly 2000 or 2010. And in the last 10, 15, 20 years, we see in many stands a steep decline in the growth rate and a very slight increase as well in mortality. Then for beech, we have seen roughly 2/3 of the stands in the lowlands actually have a negative growth trend. And we have a slight increase in beech mortality, but this is lower than in the uplands where we have on south exposed slopes a higher dieback. Then the oaks, at least in northern Germany, mostly stable growth rates at the moment and more irregular dieback events, mostly related to frost insect attack, but a slight impact probably also by the mega drought in 2018. And finally, some of these minor broadleaf tree species, mostly Norway maple, little leaf, linden, hornbeam, also ash, still have mostly stable growth rates and only a slight increase, with ash, of course, infected by the fungus, but we have only investigated here healthy stands. And finally, I would present here one study done by a colleague in Freiburg who has investigated the underlying possible causes of the climate sensitivity of the different tree species. And he has compiled data on the heat tolerance and the drought tolerance of 15 tree species. And he has used the heat sensitivity of photosystem 2. This is on the y-axis, and the embolism resistance of the xylem, this is on the x-axis. And according to his data, our local conifers are more sensitive in both aspects, so heat sensitivity and drought sensitivity. This is Scots pine, this is silver fir, this is spruce, and this is Douglas fir. And mostly the broadleaf tree species are more resistant to both stressors. This is my last slide. To make some recommendations for the foresters in northern Germany, so this is only for the lowlands, we must clearly say that beech has been found to be fairly drought sensitive. We can even show this in maps. We can define a high risk region, which is east of this red line. And at the moment, we define this by the 350 millimeter summer precipitation isoline. I would not suggest to plant more beech in this region at the moment. And we found that both spruce and Douglas fir are fairly drought and heat sensitive. Spruce, of course, much more than Douglas fir, but Douglas fir is also heat and drought sensitive, and both are susceptible to insect attack. Then our data indicate the Scots pine is only a medium drought resistant species, not so drought hardy as thought before. The disadvantage clearly is that it consumes more water than broadleaf tree species, and it's quite fire promoting. Most of the fires in northern Germany are in Scots pine stands, and this could be a growing problem in climate warming. Then we found for sessile oak. They are still quite drought and heat resistant at the moment, but of course there are many pest species, and this can cause problems locally. And then the minor broadleaf tree species, I'm mostly talking about Norway maple, hornbeam, little-leaved linden, and the other oak species of southeastern Europe. They are not important for forestry at the moment, but they are clearly more drought resistant and apparently less susceptible to pest attack. So at least for the lowlands of northern Central Europe, I would clearly recommend to replace conifers in a large style by broadleaf tree species. And if we introduce tree species, I would preferably select species from neighboring regions, so southeastern Europe or the sub-Mediterranean regions, to avoid the invasion of pathogens, for example, from North America or Eastern Asia. Yeah, thank you very much. This was what I wanted to present here.
Great, Christoph. Thank you for a fantastic talk. I'll just go and slash my wrists, I think, but really superb. So we have now time for questions. What we normally do is we write the questions into the chat box because there's quite a lot of people here, and it's the best way of controlling it online. So does anybody want to start? Yeah, here, Cindy. Welcome, Cindy. Cindy Prescott. Can you see this, Christoph? Can you see it in the chat box as well?
Yeah,
I'll read it just so that you can't. But are there genotypes from farther south that could be used? So,
which species do you mean? You mean beech, for example? Yeah, there's a lot of research on different provenances, of course. This is probably quite promising. However, we do not have much data, for example, on frost resistance. And the data on drought resistance and heat resistance are just only emerging at the moment. So mostly these provenance data and trials are on growth patterns, on wood quality and so on. They have been collected mostly in the past. And ecophysiological data on different provenances are mostly lacking. This is emerging now, this field of research. And I would strongly recommend to also look for frost resistance, because if we mostly take, for example, beach provenances from northern Spain or from Italy, for example, they could be less frost resistant. And this could, of course, be a problem in our climate here.
Good. The next one is from Barry Gardner. With how do you separate drought mortality from subsequent bark beetle mortality in Norway spruce?
This is not separated. The data that I presented were from Thünen Institute, and they are taken from a network of stands that are regularly controlled all over Germany, from the lowlands as well as from the uplands. And then they are extrapolated by models, but they do not separate by the causes. This can be done for certain stands, of course, and these data do exist, but not for this large data set that I have presented there.
Okay, then from Andrew Hackett Payne. Thanks for the excellent talk. Broadly, the picture of our common native species is negative in terms of growth and mortality, especially at lower elevations and in drier regions. Data is much more limited for the early stages of forest demography, reproduction, and establishment. Do you have any insights of current trends for these early stages of forest demography? Are these early demographic stages something that foresters are worried about? Should they be worried about this too? It's quite a long question, but
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you are addressing, of course, saplings and seedlings and the drought and heat resistance of these stages. And of course, there are, I think, quite many studies already completed or underway at the moment, where lots of provenances of beech, for example, are tested for drought and heat. I'm quite aware of some of these studies where they use provenances from Poland, even from Sweden and from Spain and so on, and compare this. If you address the question whether the saplings are more sensitive than the old trees, I think this question is not so easy to answer. We have conducted such a study, but this was the results were varied. In certain senses, for example, embolism resistance, the saplings were more sensitive than the other trees. But in other aspects, this was the other way around. And I think there's still data emerging at the moment. So I couldn't decide well whether the young beeches are actually more sensitive. I think for Douglas fir, as far as I know the literature, I think it's actually so that the saplings are more drought sensitive than the old trees. I think there's a lot of evidence supporting this, but for beech, I'm not so sure.
yeah, it's a very, very similar. I want to use the whole, well, we can do actually. It's from Dan Binkley. On an early slide showed trends for beech at 40 years of age, controlling for trends that might be age versus climate related. Some later slides might not have controlled for age, for example, Douglas fir. Overall, is there a trend for older or younger trees stands to show higher or lower climate sensitivity, which is very similar to what you just
Yeah,
discussed?
we have in the beech data we have controlled for age, and in the Douglas fir stands, it's a case that they were all between, I think, 45 and 60 years. So the age range is quite small. We had no older stands than 70 years. I think they're not available there, and we did not investigate younger stands. In the oaks, for example, they are all in the range of 100 to 140 years, for example. So we do not have different age classes, which could have a larger influence on the outcome.
Okay. Then another interesting related one from Chris Chase. I have worked with Douglas fir in North America, and there are two varieties. One variety, Mendel, grows west of the Cascade Mountains and grows much faster and receives more precipitation than the variety that grows more inland, slower, and tolerates more drought and heat.
Mhm.
Do you know which Douglas fir variety was more commonly planted in northern Germany? That's an interesting
Yeah, that's the
question.
case. I think there are the different subspecies. Menziesi, for example, which is the coastal variety. This is, in our words, the green variety. And there's the blue one, the Glauca, which is more inland, east of the Cascades. This is nearly never taken in Europe. This is always the green one. And for example, for northern Germany, this is quite widespread. I think the large majority is from a very restricted area of northern Washington state. This is the Darrington province. I think this is a quite small region, I think west of Seattle or so. So the variation in the genotypes actually in northern Germany is not that large. It's quite small. We have no inland Douglas firs. They probably are much drought and heat resistant, much more, I think so. But they are more sensitive to certain fungi, so they were avoided in the past. And of course, they're not that productive, so they are not so interesting in comparison to Norway spruce. But this might change in future if we see that the green varieties, at least in the lowlands, more susceptible to drought and heat. Maybe we could adopt different provenances. But of course, we have to check the infection by fungi and pest organisms.
Okay. Again, from Barry, there's a wonderful program called Reforce that has planted the same provenance is planted from southern Poland to northern Scotland.
Sorry, it's southern Portugal to northern Scotland.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, it's
I'll let you ask the question.
it's not a question. It's just to say that there are these arboreta that go from southern Portugal to up to Mull in Scotland, and they have exactly the same provenances of a variety of species. So the first person was asking whether you can use genotypes from further south, and that is trying to use latitude as a substitute for change in climate. So it might be worth looking out. If it was Cindy Prescott was asking that question. It's just for information.
Okay, great. Okay, so then a question from Michelle Lawrenson. Do you think that the current tree communities dominated by beech will be replaced by communities that we currently know from more warmer sites, oak, linden, lime, or will the future species composition be novel, being different species composition than those current communities from warmer sites?
Thank you, Michael. I think very important question. I think clearly in Germany and Central Europe, we have mostly managed forests, of course. I think such a natural succession would only happen, by example, in the national parks or in some very small areas. I would not expect, for example, if we take the case of northern Germany of the lowlands, even if beech is declining in vitality, I think this will take quite a long time that it will be totally replaced, because even if the canopy is opening slowly, there still are younger stages of beeches regrowing, and so there's a turnover probably of the age stages, and this might offer then possibilities that oaks are invading, linden could spread, but you must also, I think, know that, of course, most of the soils in northern Germany are quite acidic. They have a pH of less than 4, and so not many species can actually grow there. So linden can grow more in the east when you have a more continental climate, but in the more oceanic west, where you have very low soil pHs, linden cannot stand this. So there's not many species that are actually available. And if you have a long-term invasion from the south, this may take hundreds of years, and we will not see this. And this could only happen in a few national parks.
Yeah. Okay. The next question is, can we compare the situation among species for which planting density and cultivation might be very different and might have different pressures on available water resources? I have in mind differences between conifers versus broadleaves.
Yeah, of course. I think competition in the stand, of course, we have seen this in the example of beech. This is a relevant factor, of course, which affects the drought response clearly. We have taken those stem densities, which are typical for mature stands, and to investigate the role of competition, I think you would have a continuous row or sequence of stands with different densities. We don't have this available. For example, we have taken the typical stem densities for Scots pine or also for beech with closed canopies. If you have lower stem densities, for example, in Scots pine, probably they would behave much better. And the same could be, of course, if you reduce the stem density in beeches, this could help the trees survive drought in certain cases. But if you open up the canopy too much, of course, for beech, this is dangerous, I think.
Okay, and then onto another theme. Is the recommendation against beech plantation in dry areas mainly for pure stands or also for mixed species forests? And are there drought thresholds beyond which beech becomes non-viable regardless of stand composition?
Yeah, I think thank you very much. This is a very good question, of course. I think there's a lot of action to change monospecific stands to two species mixed stands currently in Central Europe. I think in many countries. I think this is very, very well done, and this should be done. But as a tree physiologist, I would say you shouldn't expect that the drought response and heat response of a tree in mixture is so much different from that in a monospecific stand. For example, against heat, the response will probably mostly the same. So if you mix the species, you can't avoid heat damage, which comes from above and sinks just into the stand. And with respect to drought, of course, if you have a neighbor, an admixed species with a lower water consumption, this is, of course, then profiting the other species. If, for example, if you mix Douglas fir with beech, I think this is good for Douglas fir because beech consumes less water. We have also done measurements on that. But for beech, it's more or less a disadvantage because beech then has a strong water spender like Douglas fir, and then beech has less water. So I think mixtures are good in certain as aspects for biodiversity, for the soil, and so on, and for reducing the economic risk, of course, of loss. But with respect directly to heat and drought resistance, I'm not so optimistic. I think this wouldn't save a species which is endangered by climate warming. For example, in Eastern Germany, in the center of this arid area that we have there, when you plant their beech in mixture, for example, with pine or with oak, this wouldn't help beech too much. I think this is just a physiological question, and this is not changed too much in a mixture in comparison to a monospecific stand.
Okay. And then last one written at the moment anyway. I'm interested in Scots pine. Have you considered the soil type of your analysis? Scots pine seems more susceptible to drought on more fertile soils, which also had more moisture in the past. Now drought causes weakening of these stands and makes them susceptible to bark beetle attacks or mistletoe. Without considering site and soil conditions, conclusions may be misleading. So how does it?
Yeah, I think this is a very important remark. I think there are many data emerging or have been published already that show the large influence of nitrogen on the drought resistance of trees. And this is known for Scots pine, but also for beech and spruce and other species. And actually our data were from this transect, this precipitation transect in northern Germany. This is mostly quite infertile soils. So they have a pH in the range of 3 to say 5. They have not a high fertility. They are moderately to low fertile stands. So we didn't compare them to highly fertile stands. And this is probably different, for example, in the Upper Rhine Valley, where we have a local Scots pine dieback, actually, where probably is probably better. I'm not aware of data there, but I would assume. And perhaps maybe even in the Central Alps, where Scots pine is dying in larger stands. These are, as far as I know, limestone soils, and probably they have a better nitrogen supply, but we have to ask the Swiss colleagues there.
Okay. So just to carry on with this mixed species, is there any advantage of doing this if you have situations like you have in Eastern Germany? What do? Do you just plant something that you've got the best chance of growing, or do you plant mixtures of the things that's got the best chance of growing?
Yeah, I think I will always promote mixtures, of course. I think this is just from an economic point of view. I think you just reduce your economic loss risk, of course. This is the first point, I think. And it has many advantages for the soil, for biodiversity, and so on. So I would plant mixtures. I would also perhaps use low amounts of beech in certain areas which are not that dry from the soil, for example, which are more loamy, for example, have a higher water storage capacity in the soil. But I would mix this up with different oak species, for example. If it's possible, I would plant linden, hornbeam, Norway maple, for example. And of course, Scots pine in certain regions, perhaps mixing them with beech, this is fine. But I think these large-scale monocultures of Scots pine, these are from the past, and they probably will not exist in the future anymore. Probably, I think the foresters are changing them by themselves. This is my impression, because we have also a higher fire risk now in Brandenburg, for example. So I think 30 years or 40 years in the future, I think this cannot be, it's not bearable in the future, I think, anymore.
Yes, another problem that solves itself, like lowland spruce in northern Germany.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Christoph, thank you very much indeed. I just make one. Well, no. Well, first of all, I thank you for your talk. That was truly excellent, and it obviously hit a lot of nerve. We got 86 or 87 people today. So that's really cool. I'm glad to see so many people there.
Let me thank you also for all these questions and for all the attendance. It was a great hour. Thanks a lot.
And again, Christoph, thank you very much indeed. So
Thanks.
bye-bye.
Bye.